The creek didn't care about property lines. It curved behind fences, slipped under split-rail posts, and kept a stubborn memory of every storm that had ever passed through the valley. Long before I closed on the house at the end of Alder Lane, the stream had already chosen its habits. A quicksilver thread in summer, a brown, muscled ribbon in winter, a moving corridor for dragonflies, minnows, and the occasional raccoon that knew how to pry a lid off a trash bin. I learned its voice in that first month, pebbles ticking like glass under the current when the wind picked up, frogs trying out the night like a choir warming up. It was messy in the way that life is messy. Leaves, twigs, volunteer grasses, the slick shadow of water over rock. It was also the reason I bought the place. The HOA brochure never mentioned the creek. It mentioned premier amenities and curated aesthetics. Offered stock photos of porches with lanterns that had never faced an insect. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, arrived as a digital brick. Font sizes that defied eyesight, clauses that treated front yard mulch like a peace treaty. Somewhere in that text, a paragraph acknowledged water features with the kind of reluctant tone reserved for stepchildren. Maintenance was encouraged. Modifications required architectural review. The words floodplain and permit never met in the same sentence. The president of the HOA board had a name that matched the legend, Karen. The neighborhood called her Precision. Lines on lawns went straight when she walked by. Trash cans would tuck themselves back against fences without being asked. Her SUV's paint looked waxed even when it rained. She had a way of tilting her head that made everything look like a rule that had just been broken. No dialogue was necessary to understand her style. Letters appeared, fines followed, and every message wore a perfume of certainty. To her, the creek behind my yard was an untidy sentence fragment in a paragraph of otherwise obedient landscaping. The first letter labeled the stream an erosion hazard and visual discord. It attached a photo of willow shoots leaning toward the water like uncombed hair. It recommended a hardening solution to stabilize the channel and harmonize aesthetics. I read that phrase 3 times. The creek, it seemed, needed to be harmonized. Nature would be asked to keep time. Experience taught a different rhythm. Streams flex in flood and relax in drought. They move a little, braid a little, and call it balance. Hard edges make them angry. I knew enough to check the county portal, to search for floodplain overlays, riparian buffer requirements, and the long list of permits that wake up when anyone touches running water. I found maps that traced the creek like a blue vein and ordinances that spoke in cautious, bureaucratic verbs. Consult, notify, obtain. The HOA would need to ask permission from forces outside of itself. The creek answered to gravity and law. The second letter came with the quiet pressure of a ticking clock: compliance expectations, timeline, community standard. It proposed a contractor. It admired concrete liners in a neighboring subdivision as if they were the latest countertop trend. Somewhere beneath the adjectives ran the old fear that wildness lowers property values, that a stream making its own choices is a kind of offense. I documented the creek anyway, before photos, date stamps, a simple log of water level and color after each rain. I'd learned in other chapters of life that documentation is how you speak when the room gets loud. Autumn advanced. Leaves released their grip in a steady, untheatrical way. The stream grew shy, shouldering itself between stones and saving energy for the winter to come. Contractors' trucks began appearing at the entrance to our development at odd hours, diesel lingering like a stubborn guest long after the engines were off. Rumor volunteered details that emails did not. A board vote, a waiver from someone with a title, a sense that paperwork could be invented if the plan moved quickly enough. I watched the creek and waited for the sound that changes a landscape. The thud of a pallet, the bright complaint of rebar against metal. The first load of bagged cement arrived before sunrise on a weekday according to my cameras, stacked like a future around the bend where the creek converged with a drainage swale. The crew wore anonymity, rental logo on the mixer, blank t-shirts, a borrowed clip of authority that they assumed was real because someone with a checkbook said it was. By mid-morning, a line of forms sat where willow roots had held the bank in a frayed, faithful way. The forms were square because forms are square. The creek curved anyway. There is a moment, just before wet concrete hits moving water, when the world has not yet decided whether it will forgive the decision. I stood on my side of the fence with the camera running and felt the quiet turn heavy. This was not beautification. This was amputation with a brochure. That afternoon, I sent the kind of email that leaves handprints. It went to the board, to the property manager, to County Environmental Services, and to an inbox at the Army Corps of Engineers that I found by following a breadcrumb trail through old meeting minutes. It contained GIS screenshots and a page of citations. Clean Water Act sections that treat streams as citizens, county code that knows the word permit, and a photograph of minnows too small to know they were about to become an exhibit. The subject line was a bridge between politeness and warning. The creek, unconsulted, did what creeks do when something tries to hold them still. It worked around the forms, found seams, tested edges, and waited for rain. By dusk, the cement had set enough to look permanent. It wore the gray of certainties and the confident seam of trowel lines. In the new silence that followed, frogs delayed their rehearsal. I went inside and filed the notes that would become a record. The next chapter would not be written by brochures, it would be written by weather. The county moves at the pace of a file folder, but environmental law has a long memory. The complaint logged against our HOA generated a case number with the warm neutrality of a thermostat, neither angry nor friendly, simply ready to measure. The first site visit was scheduled for next available, which in government means soon enough to matter if the sky cooperates. Meanwhile, the HOA accelerated. New emails praised progress, a word used here like a sedative. A photo in the community newsletter displayed the poured section as if it were a patio. The creek was now a product. Concrete behaves a certain way when it first meets a hydrograph. Flow concentrates at edges, searches for seams, and finding none begins to undercut the next available weakness. Here, that was the remodeled corner where the contractors had shaved away root mass to seat a neat 90-degree angle. Within 48 hours, the water had etched a small scowl in the downstream bank, tracing the patience of physics. Erosion, the HOA's original fear, grew out of the fix like a shadow that knew where it came from. Upstream neighbors noticed the shift without needing the language for it. Their lawn chairs felt closer to the edge. A garden gnome at the property line seemed to lean. I added these observations to the log in the unemotional format that officials respect. Date, time, location, measurement by tape, photo with scale. At the end of each entry, I wrote a single unadorned sentence, no posted permit. The absence of a small laminated placard spoke louder than any argument. The board's next memo arrived with a professional letterhead that borrowed credibility from margins and spacing. It referred to the creek as a runoff conveyance, a phrase that tries to make water a mere employee. It mentioned aesthetic uplift, reduced maintenance, and community desirability. It never used the word riverine or riparian. It never admitted the existence of fish. It attached a fine to my account under the category noncompliance with approved improvement, as if my failure to applaud counted as vandalism. The amount was small, the message was not. I prepared for weather the way an engineer prepares for a test, stakes in the ground, chalked reference marks on the fence post. A time-lapse pointed at the new concrete seam. I studied the forecast in the careful way locals do after years of disappointment and surprise. The national radar offered a polite blue smear over our county for Monday, but the coastal satellite showed a long, wet mussel curling toward us. The phrase atmospheric river entered the nightly news with a graphic that made it look like an invitation. Before the first drop, the county inspector materialized on the path behind my fence with a clipboard that had seen other disputes. Boots sank a fraction into bank soil. Eyes took inventory, poured section. Lack of silt fence, a pile of unused bags stacked within the buffer where common sense would not have left them. The inspector's questions were asked with a pencil. What contractor, what approvals, what pre-construction meeting? The HOA manager looped into the site walk by a calendar invite she could not ignore, answered in the elliptical grammar of someone who had never expected the creek to argue back. We understood, we were advised, we believed. None of those verbs appear on permits. The Army Corps replied from a distance, but the sentences carried weight. If the work occurred below the ordinary high water mark, began one email, it is subject to Section 400 for permitting. The words were dry the way firewood is dry, ready to burn with the first spark. The inspector took photos with a practiced eye and promised a follow-up letter. Paperwork had entered the channel, and like any object placed in moving water, it would either snag or lodge with force. The storm arrived on a Friday afternoon with the slow drumroll that makes neighbors look up from barbecue plans and check gutters. The creek lifted shoulder by shoulder, first staining brown at the edges, then darkening to the uniform coffee color that means the watershed is awake. Water started tracing a new line along the fresh concrete, nose pressed to the puzzle, deciding whether to accept the new geometry or rewrite it. By midnight, the decision had been made. Flow climbed the bank and probed the angle that the contractor had carved into the willow's former seat. The undercut deepened, soil let go in slabs, and the current ferried those chunks downstream like offerings. On the opposite side, Karen's side, the flat lawn that once welcomed lawn games began to lose its confidence. Grass that had previously felt ornamental learned the word saturated. The creek, narrowed by design, gained speed like a rumor. Water that could have spread its energy over a wider, softer bed now clenched into a fist. What concrete seems to promise permanence is often only deferral. It moves the problem downstream or sideways, sends it into basements and across property lines, hides it until the map is redrawn by insurance adjusters. By the second night, downspouts across the subdivision were contributing to a choir the HOA had not considered in its newsletter, the harmony of a watershed remembering its shape. The cul-de-sac drains gurgled. The curb lips wore thin cataracts. The creek filled its lungs. On the third morning, I marked the high water line on the fence with a pencil and a date. The chalk on the post had risen 2 inches above Friday's mark. The concrete wore its new scuffs like a bruise. The county inspector's follow-up note arrived in my inbox with subject line clarity, Cease and desist, unpermitted channel modification. The letter referenced specific photos, measurements, and the statute numbers that get judges to lean forward. Fines would follow, restoration would be required. The creek had earned its first ally in bureaucracy, but paperwork like rebar only matters when it meets load. The load was still forming offshore, stacking itself into a conveyor belt of rain that forecasters mentioned with respectful distance. The HOA board scheduled an emergency session to discuss public relations. They did not schedule a session to discuss hydrology. The storm did not attend their Zoom. It had its own agenda. Neighborhoods can absorb a certain amount of folly before they flinch. A holiday decoration rule that overreaches, a letter about mailbox fonts, a planted accusation that wilts under daylight, these pass, leaving only small dents in the social metal. A stream is less forgiving. It keeps a ledger in silt and marks its entries on basement walls. The HOA framed the crisis as a communications problem. A bulletin went out about misunderstandings and enhancements. It praised volunteer efforts to beautify the commons. It used the phrase temporary water discoloration, the way a brochure might describe a house fire as unexpected warmth. Comments began to stack beneath the post on the community app like sandbags, some supportive, many not. Residents who had never cared about watershed maps suddenly learned the shape of their lot's elevation. A quiet, informal geography club convened in driveways with mugs of coffee as props. People pointed at swalls and fence lines. They spoke in arrows. The board scheduled a town hall in the clubhouse and arranged chairs as if furniture could arrest a storm. The property manager repeated talking points like a metronome: safety, cohesion, value. Absent from the slide deck were the directives from the county and the Corps. Their silence had an intent: to control the story long enough that the storm would pass and the concrete would become a fact too heavy to move. But weather has excellent timing. It knows when to arrive. While the room negotiated adjectives, the radar panel on a dozen phones deepened from polite green to serious yellow and then to the kind of orange that implies power outages. The barometer in every knee joint ached. The second atmospheric river in a week lined itself up and made a case that no board vote could override. By midnight, the culverts at the entrance hummed with a low panic. The creek behind my fence rose with a confidence that looked practiced. Debris that had once been leaves and sticks arranged itself into informal dams at the new concrete seam. The narrowed channel sped up and angled its shoulder at the far bank, Karen's bank, where a wide lawn slid gently toward a pair of egress windows cut into concrete when the house was young and the builder took shortcuts. The lot had been marketed as water adjacent. It had never been meant to be water admitting. Basements are truth tellers. They reveal grading mistakes and wishful thinking. They tell the story of a neighborhood's decisions with rings and stains. In the early hours, a curtain of water began to find the path of least resistance along the new hard edge, skating around the formwork's end and driving itself toward those window wells. Gravel, selected once for its decorative compliance, offered no friction. The wells filled like glasses set under a faucet. Sump pumps sang their one-note song, and for a brief span, the neighborhood believed that technology would keep its contract, but pumps lose arguments against rivers that have had enough. The first gurgle from beneath Karen's stairs became a steady syllable and then a paragraph. Water introduced itself to drywall as if it had been invited. Streams trade. When one path is blocked, they purchase a new one with momentum. The illegal narrowing of the channel behind my fence had bought a new direction. Across the small fence gap behind Karen's AC unit, down along the foundation line to the stairwell drain no one had maintained, and into a basement that had advertised bonus living space and elevated finishes. If nature were petty, it might have paused to read the listing aloud. But nature is not petty, it is efficient. The fish arrived as stowaways upstream. A retention pond stocked with mosquito-eating minnows overflowed into the storm system, which overflowed into the creek, which overflowed into the narrowed chute, which sent its concentration toward a basement that had never imagined scales. In the light of a security camera that had never been asked to witness a biology lesson, silver streaks translated the surface, followed by grass and lost mulch, and one unmoored rubber ball with a faded superhero logo on it. The camera footage would later play on phones in living rooms like a strange nature documentary. For the moment, it served as the only record of a choice made by physics in response to a choice made by a board. At sunrise, the neighborhood met itself. Trucks paused at the entrance under the blinking caution of a buried stop sign. People stepped into boots they owned for fashion and discovered function. Text threads scrambled into chains of tasks. Check on the elderly couple at Maple Bend, clear the storm grate at the corner, move bikes and boxes for the family with toddlers. The HOA sent another bulletin about weather impacts, and nobody read it. Information now flowed in boots, tarps, and the shared language of bailing. I walked the fence line and recorded the new high water mark, a full hand above the last pencil line, then pivoted to the back corner where the fence shared a post with Karen's side. The ground told the story without adjectives. An incised channel where there had not been one, scoured down to root near the AC pad, a churned path of water that had learned it could take the shortcut. The new concrete step behind my fence had behaved like a fulcrum, transferring load to the bank directly across. It had not solved erosion, it had delivered it. County trucks arrived by mid-morning without their usual restraint. The inspector's boots wore a new urgency. Tape went up across the path where the crew had stored excess bags. A second official from Environmental Health joined with a moisture meter and a clipboard that asked different questions. Flood claims would follow. The word liability entered the conversation in a tone that suggested the end of patience. Inside the clubhouse, the board met with lawyers who spoke like raincoats, protective, crinkly, and not particularly warm. Insurance carriers asked the question they always ask when a preventable loss becomes a spreadsheet. What did you know, when did you know it, and who touched the stream? Emails prepared to meet discovery. Screenshots of posts were quietly captured. The creek kept rising a little, then easing, then rising again, rehearsing its point for anyone who was still unsure. By dusk, pumps began to win and water retreated to its job. It left behind minnows, small bewildered commas, in a basement that now smelled like a renovation estimate. Buckets became aquariums for day while the kids up the street learned the difference between rescue and blame. Parents explained that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that wear neckties. The HOA did not issue a statement about fish. The storm's tail wagged itself dry overnight, and the sky resumed a blue that felt unearned. The creek fell back into its low, familiar register and carried away what it could of the evidence, leaving the rest for cameras and claim adjusters. The next chapter would involve folders and signatures and a board that learned the difference between optics and outcomes when both are soaked through. After storms, a neighborhood breathes out and then inhales sharply when the paperwork begins. Damage is not just water measured in inches, it is also letters measured in tone. Adjusters entered basements with lamps on poles and tape measures clipped like stethoscopes. They scanned walls, probed sill plates, and asked pre-printed questions. In one house, small fish nosed the sides of a clear storage bin while a toddler watched with the solemnity of a pastor. Even the adjuster smiled because some scenes rewrite the day's priorities. Insurance, like water, follows channels. It looks for drops it can avoid and paths of least resistance. Where homeowners carried the standard policies that dreamed about hail more than hydrology, coverage flexed hesitantly. Where unpermitted modifications to watercourses could be traced to a board-approved project, exclusions sharpened. The HOA's master policy met these words with the careful caution of a deer at a stream. Carriers asked for contractor names, permits, engineering stamps, and the minutes that prove intent. With each absent document, the burden slid toward the association like a pallet of cement edging closer to a ledge. The county's letter shifted from advisory to corrective. Immediate stabilization was required, not with more concrete, but with the language of restoration. Remove the hardening, replant native willow and sedge, rebuild the bank on a slope that remembers floods. The Army Corps reply acquired capitalization, unauthorized discharge of fill material into waters of the United States. Administrative penalties gathered like distant thunder. In one paragraph, the agency named the remedy that would become a budget line none of the board members had anticipated. Restore, monitor, report, repeat. The HOA had asked to beautify. It would now learn to remediate. Residents organized in the way neighborhoods do when damage writes a headline. A spreadsheet surfaced that tracked basement claims, pump rentals, and volunteer hours spent hauling soggy boxes. Another tracked the board's decisions across the past year. Who proposed, who voted, what the language said. In that ledger, patterns became visible. Aesthetic arguments had repeatedly outrun technical ones. Clean lines had trumped buffers. The creek had been treated as a mood board, now it would be treated as evidence. Meanwhile, the minnows earned their subplot. Parents carried the bins to the retention pond that had birthed the accidental migration. The water there had cleared and resumed the unremarkable job of being water. Children poured with the ceremony of 1,000 tiny parades. The fish slipped back without comment. Their presence in the basement had never been about symbolism. It had only been about route. The board held a meeting under fluorescent lights for a crowd that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Folding chairs multiplied like mushrooms after rain. An agenda projected on a wall spoke soothingly of updates and next steps. The audience spoke in a different register. Receipts, reports, the dates on emails compared to the dates on invoices compared to the dates on photos. When words like Section 404 and riparian buffer began to appear in resident sentences, the board's posture changed. Authority recognized that it was no longer the only person who had read a manual. The property manager tried to wrap the evening in professionalism. The lawyer advised a pause. A motion rose from the floor like weather. Form an independent committee to interface with agencies, oversee restoration, and negotiate with insurers. The board hesitated and then noticed that hesitation is a kind of vote. The motion carried. The HOA learned abruptly. That governance means letting go when you have held on to the wrong thing. The restoration plan drafted by the committee and the county read like the creek's autobiographical note. Remove the concrete carefully to avoid further scarring. Regrade the bank to a stable angle. Install coir logs. Plant live stakes of willow at measured intervals. Seed with a native mix that knows how to hold soil without grid lines. Monitor during 2 rainy seasons and report survival rates. It was neither fast nor cheap, which is to say it was real. Cost has a way of making the abstract visible. An emergency assessment appeared on the horizon, and with it, a recall petition. This part of the story is always the least cinematic and the most consequential. Neighbors gathering signatures at kitchen tables, text threads moving like tidewater, ballot envelopes stamped with personal history. The vote that followed ended an era where curb appeal had been a stand-in for stewardship. The new board introduced itself not with a photograph but with a schedule of work. Karen's house told a parallel tale in courtrooms and in letters with her name at the top. Insurance had questions that no one could answer without the worst kind of honesty. Contractors were unable or unwilling to produce permits for work they had taken in cash. The county assessed fines that wore the gravity of precedent. People who had once treated her like a standard bearer now avoided eye contact at the mailbox. Hurricanes reshuffle beaches. This storm had reshuffled credibility. Crews arrived with the careful energy of undoing. Concrete that had been permanent for 2 weeks met diamond blades and then wheelbarrows. An excavator operator with hands like a musician teased apart bank and mistake. The creek watched with the steady gaze of a patient who recognizes a competent surgeon. When the last chunk lifted, water paused and then tested the slope, found familiar angles, and resumed its habit of being slightly unruly. The sound of frogs returned one at a time, as if checking attendance. Restoration work always looks like too little, too late in the first month. Coir logs resemble stuffed sausages, stakes look like hope on a stick, but willows have a long game. Grasses become hands, roots whisper in mesh, and then they hold. The kids on Alder Lane learned new words without flashcards: fascine, revetment, toe. They also learned old words that had slept under the brochure's pillow: neighbor, common good, consequence. By the end of spring, the bank wore green that didn't need pruning schedules. The water had learned where to eddy again. Minnows returned because minnows always do when the margins are soft. The HOA received its next letter from the county with a tone that allowed relief to share a paragraph with accountability. The creek had not been beautified, it had been respected. There's a difference the eye can feel. There remained one more ledger to balance trust. That account replenishes slowly. In small deposits, a board posting minutes before anyone asks, a budget line that does not hide behind euphemism, a workday where neighbors plant and end the morning with dirty hands and clean jokes. The chapter would close on paperwork that expected another site visit after the next major storm. That was the point. Nature and government would be on the same calendar now. The story left the cul-de-sac and found a wider room. A local investigative reporter who had grown bored of ribbon cuttings asked for the documents, and the documents obliged. Emails and letters don't need makeup. They sit under lights and read themselves. The segment that aired a week later treated the creek with more dignity than the brochure ever had. It placed a map on the screen not as decoration but as explanation. Viewers watched floodwater choose a line that people had redrawn for convenience and then felt the echo of a small fish flicking in a plastic bin. Other HOAs called the county to ask nervous questions with careful adjectives. How close is too close? What counts as maintenance? Do we need a permit to do what we've always done? The county's FAQ grew a new section, short and plain. You need a permit if the water is real. If you can throw a leaf into it and watch it go somewhere, it is real. The new board, with its committee of adults who knew the weight of signatures, turned a crisis into a syllabus. A town hall titled Streams, Not Decorations, filled the clubhouse with people who weren't there to score points. A hydrologist with the tone of a favorite teacher explained meanders and floodplains with a rope on the floor. A biologist held up a net and named what had been briefly trapped in a basement. The property manager listened. Listening can be an apology when it is consistent. Restitution had its own pace. The association's reserve study learned new vocabulary in the section where contingencies live. The old board's decisions translated into dollars per household with the neutrality of a calculator. People paid, grumbled, and also admitted that Saturdays by a healed stream were worth more than an ornamental perfection that leaks. Lawsuits shuffled into existence with the weary dignity of paperwork that knows it is necessary. Some settled, some waited their turn. A contractor disappeared into a new phone number, a lawyer did not. Karen became a cautionary sentence delivered quickly for the sake of moving on. Her basement dried, her claims did not. Her name left agendas and remained in case captions. A for sale sign appeared, which was always going to be part of the arc. The listing mentioned proximity to natural water features. The photos angled carefully away from the bank. Buyers know how to read between pixels when a neighborhood has recently been on television. The creek arrived at summer wearing a slightly different course, gentler on the outside of bends and firmer at the toes where the coir had invited roots. Kayaks would have laughed at its scale, herons did not. They came, legs like deliberate thoughts, and rehearsed the old choreography of hunting. A child counted 5, then 8, then lost track. The HOA newsletter printed a photo shot from above, an aerial donated by a resident with a hobby drone, and for once the caption did not pretend authorship. It said simply, "Restoration Month 3. The minnows went back to being anonymous. They multiplied in the places shallow enough to warm and deep enough to hide. Kids stopped carrying bins to the retention pond and went back to bikes." No one forgot the storm exactly. They filed it where important things go, not in fear but in readiness. Sump pump maintenance became a ritual. Rain barrels multiplied. The community Facebook group discovered that it could be more than a complaint board. Someone posted a list of native plants with photos and watering notes. Someone else posted a rake and labeled it "free to borrow." Social media learned how to be social. The county scheduled a final inspection for the fall, when roots would have completed their first season of quiet labor. The letter used adjectives sparingly. The inspector would bring a checklist. If survivorship hit the targets, the HOA would transition from weekly to seasonal monitoring. The stream, in other words, would be treated as a neighbor again, not an accessory. That afternoon, I sat on the back step with a coffee and watched the water field test every decision we had made. It moved like someone late for a train, and then slowed as if remembering there was more than one stop. A pair of kids from Maple Bend wrote names in the damp bank with a stick and then watched the stream blur them away. Lessons arrive without lesson plans if you're willing to let them. No one in our neighborhood will ever use the phrase "beautify the creek" again without hearing a basement door creak and a pump wake up in protest. The phrase will be replaced by ones that respect process: stabilize, consult, restore. It won't make for glossier brochures, but it will make for quieter storms. Not every story earns an epilogue. This one did because it involved a living thing that refuses to be final. The creek keeps writing in present tense. That is its character and its gift. A year later, the inspection passed with the board professionalism that signals real success. The county official checked boxes, nodded at willow stakes that had become willows, and typed a note about bank stability that would sleep inside a PDF until the next rain. The Army Corps closed its file with a paragraph that mentioned compliance and monitoring and a line that could be read as a warning or a benediction. Future work must be permitted prior to initiation. Everyone wrote it into their calendars as a recurring event called Ask First. The HOA has a new habit of telling on itself before anyone else has to. Meeting agendas go up a week ahead without being begged for. Minutes arrive with actual minutes attached, not a collage of corporate nouns. Budgets carry footnotes that explain instead of distract. The board learned with some pain that governance is not a look, it is a practice. The creek taught other lessons too. It put kids in hip boots and handed them dip nets. A science teacher from the middle school turned our little water course into a field lab with laminated sheets that gave names to what most of us had called bugs. Mayfly nymphs arrived as tiny metrics of health. The kids found them, squealed, and then spoke about them the way only new experts do: earnest, precise, happy. Adults learned to nod and listen. The phrase "FishTankBasement" became a joke we told on ourselves during the neighborhood cleanup day when someone found a plastic aquarium castle wedged in the bank roots. It had probably floated in from upstream, a relic of a pet that had been promised more attention than it received. We planted it at the edge of a kid's plot in the community garden where tomatoes grew with the arrogant joy of anything that has finally been given the right soil. Karen's house changed hands. The new owners arrived with a truck full of furniture that belonged to a quieter life. They joined the restoration committee without needing convincing because moving near a creek had taught them reverence. The sign in the yard that once summed up the chapter in shorthand was replaced by a small plaque near the path, paid for by a fine the county had levied and the HOA had accepted as tuition. It read, "A creek is not a line to be cleaned. It is a story to be respected." Children drew around it in chalk until the message looked like it was wearing a party. On the anniversary of the storm, the neighborhood set tables near the clubhouse for a potluck that didn't try too hard to be symbolic. Someone brought cornbread, someone else a spreadsheet of who had paid what and when. A hydrologist showed up as a neighbor, not a lecturer, and accepted a paper plate like everyone else. People traded weather app screenshots from the week that reordered priorities. Laughter lived in the same air as memory because resilience is the only way to keep both in view. Not all consequences were erased, and that is a good thing. A few houses still showed faint water lines in utility rooms if you knew where to look, and those lines now functioned as a kind of calendar, a reminder that denies forgetting without demanding reliving. Sump pump backups were serviced on schedule. Kids who had once carried minnows in storage bins now carried clipboards on field days. The HOA still enforced rules about trash cans and paint colors, but now with an understood clause that read, "And also we defer to gravity." If there is a closing lesson in a chapter that resists closure, it is this: every attempt to bend nature into an accessory will grow a counterstory with a cost. The stream is not your guest. It is your neighbor who was here before the fences. If you treat it like a mess to be filed under aesthetic, it will file you under example. If you treat it as a member of the community with rights and needs and a language, it will reward you with the quiet abundance that makes real estate brochures unnecessary. Shade, sound, life. The last pencil mark on my fence post sits lower than the worst of that week, but higher than most rains since. It keeps vigil without drama. I sometimes run a finger over it the way you rub a scar that taught you not to run with scissors. The creek below answers with its old voice, pebbles clicking, water finding a way, frogs taking attendance after sunset. It thanks no one and accuses no one. It simply continues, which is the best possible ending and the only honest one. Those who watch from far away with the familiar itch to comment would have their own conclusions. Some would call it overblown, some inevitable. Some earned, we learned not to write for them. We wrote for the storm, for the minnows that took a tour of a basement, for the willow that sprouted from a stick, and for the neighbors who now know that the shortest distance between aesthetics and disaster is a straight line poured in a hurry. When the next heavy system aims for the coast and the weather maps color themselves with intention, our neighborhood will not hold a meeting about optics. It will clear grates, check pumps, move boxes off floors, and refresh a folder named permits that has become a kind of talisman. The creek will rise and fall. A few fish will find new eddies, the frogs will rehearse, and if the water wants to remember the basement for a moment, it will find the door closed and the path to the retention pond open and soft. This is not triumph, it is attention. In the long catalog of human errors corrected by weather, beautified creeks and their quiet revenge occupy only a few lines. But they are our lines, and we have learned to read them.